Prof, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk about the climate change. This is a very popular topic, and then also being discussed heavily in World Economic Forum. But I want to talk about the climate governance first. But how do you define climate governance in 2025? Given that we have a lot of discussion about different style of governance and understanding about climate change, and also the standard of managing climate change from the global south countries and also the advanced countries as well.
Well, I think global governance of climate change in 2025 is at a very interesting inflection point. Because for many countries, global north and global south, climate change is increasingly not only about managing the Earth's emissions to limit temperature change, although of course that's at the core, but it's also about health, it's about economic opportunity, it's about industrial policy to compete with economic competitors. So it's all about all these things, energy security, that are actually core to government's interests. What we're seeing actually is different governments going in very different directions in that. Some relying more on their traditional fossil fuel uses, like my own country, the United States, and others really doubling down on the new energy revolution. And so we're seeing a big change in the global north and the global south on how we think about this problem.
Yeah, but how do you see the effort, especially under the Paris Agreement? What's lacking in terms of Paris Agreement 1, and then we also have President Donald Trump, who says that we're going to start to use oil more currently. Will that hinder all the process that we have throughout the years?
So two things are simultaneously true about the Paris Agreement. First, since the Paris Agreement, countries have lowered emissions by a huge amount. So we're probably on course for something like a 3 or 4 degree temperature change in the century before the Paris Agreement, and now it's more like 2.7, which is way too high, but still a lot lower than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And so to get down to where we want to be, which is well below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees, we need countries to step up. And now in 2025 is the moment for them to do their third round of pledges under the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions. So we're all looking to see what will happen with this latest pledge. I think 7 countries have pledged so far. Malaysia's not yet amongst them. But we look forward to seeing all countries do this third round.
Now, this is very interesting because you mentioned about Malaysia. And also, I want to bring the discussion into ASEAN because there's also a discussion not just between ASEAN countries but also at the World Economic Forum about how the standard should be different from developing countries and also advanced countries. Because when you put there's some sort of mold in terms of execution, it's really different from developing countries because we are developing, and not to say that at the expense of the environment, but we need some sort of space in terms of developing our countries. But how do you view the whole situation? We have different standards in terms of tackling climate change.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question because if you look at the objective data, it's absolutely unfair to use the climate as we've used it, where some people, and I say people because within countries it's the richest people who tend to use the most carbon than the poor people. In every country that's true. But also some countries have used a lot more of the atmosphere's space than others. And so if you wanted to equally allocate the climate resources, you have to go back to square one and really change that. And that's a really important part of this problem. But as I was saying before, the reason countries are acting on climate change isn't because they want to do the right thing. Maybe that's part of it for many of them. But it's actually increasingly about making sure they don't have health problems, to make sure they have economic opportunity in these new industries, to make sure they have energy security. And so for those concerns, it doesn't really matter if you're doing it for the right reason, quote unquote, or just for the practical reason. That's increasingly taking over. And so if we were in a world like we were 10 years ago, where the cost of renewable energy was significantly more than the cost of fossil fuel energy, this question really influenced climate policy. But now we're in a world where, for most parts of the world, actually renewable energy is the cheapest and easiest, most secure and cleanest source of energy. And so that question is really flipped on its head.
Yeah, I want to talk about the role of private sectors, especially in Malaysia, because at the end of the day, the public-private partnership is very important in terms of execution of the policies that are being presented by the government. But at the same time, we also have the understanding that the economy has to grow, especially in that side of the world, the ASEAN. But how do we strike a balance between developing our countries, especially in ASEAN, and at the same time ASEAN has like countries different economic background, for instance. But how do we strike a balance between focusing on industries and at the same time combating climate change? Because in Malaysia, for instance, we have new industrial master plan, which looking at the climate change as well and green action as well. But at the same time, we also have greenwashing taking place because they are being forced to some sort of executing the policies given by the government. But how do you see the greenwashing and how do you strike a balance?
So greenwashing is indeed a common problem around the world, and it used to be very easy to say, we believe in climate change, we believe in saving the forest, we believe in protecting the animals, and no one would really ask you very much. But actually what we're seeing around the world, some new research here at Oxford has been showing increasing regulation around what kinds of claims companies can make, and also what kinds of disclosures they need to make. So in most parts of the world now, companies don't just have to disclose their financial product like they do for investors. They have to disclose their carbon outcomes. They have to disclose what risks they face from climate change. And that means that the market is actually pricing in these things in a much more concrete way. And so if you are greenwashing, another word for that is saying financial fraud, that you're kind of lying to investors about what risks and opportunities you actually face. And as regulators crack down on it, I think we'll see a very different approach to these kinds of claims going forward.
Yeah. We still have a discussion about financing the effort of combating climate change at COP29, for instance, right? But at the same time, can we find tangible solutions and also innovative solutions in that sense? But how do you see the finance side will hinder all the efforts being put in place?
I think the finance side is really critical to getting this right. And actually, we now have a world where, as I said before, the science is very clear, the technology is available, the economic cost of this transition is actually making a lot more sense than it did before, but still we're not moving as fast. One of the biggest barriers is the finance question, that we can't yet find ways to actually channel investment into places where it's going. There's all sorts of problems, but one of the biggest ones is governments are still spending about 7 times more subsidizing dirty energy than they are investing in clean energy. So when the field is weighted 7 to 1 against you, it's quite hard to make the private sector investment to make money on this kind of thing. So we need smart policy. We need to kind of work through these very complicated subsidy issues and policy frameworks. But if we do that right, then the finance will flow. It's not the question of not having the money. It's a question of creating the incentives that make the money flow.
Yeah, but for businesses as well, because when I start a business and considering green action in their business strategy and business model, at the same time they need money in terms of dealing with the banking and all that. But a lot of conventional banking, they are looking at ROI at the end of the day. So of course they can consider, but then every day maybe they're still stuck with the traditional business of doing things.
Yeah.
But how do you see that the banking system, private sector especially, looking at green financing, especially in the other side of the world, which is ASEAN as well? Do they understand, and is there any willingness in terms of banking providing more monies and financing toward green business?
So I think there's a lot of interest in the financial sector and investing in these kinds of opportunities. One of the big challenges, though, is scale. So for a lot of banks, they need a kind of big project to make it worth their while to do the due diligence and to see if it's going to make a return for them. And many times renewable energy projects are a bit different from fossil fuel projects in that they're smaller in scale. You have industrial scale ones, you also have a lot of smaller ones. And so one of the key things we need to do is to bundle together different projects to make them more like a kind of commodity, a kind of financial standard product like a home mortgage or something that you can package into something larger that then helps investment to flow. So the scale issue is one of the key challenges to figure out.
But are we on the right track in terms of that?
We need to speed up. I think there's a lot of progress on these kinds of issues. For example, we've seen a lot of private sector investment following from the United States, even despite Trump, the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed for companies to get a tax credit for some of the investments they're making. You saw then private investment take off after that, right? So this is the kinds of simple things that if you get the incentives right, you can actually make a difference. Now, the hard part is not knowing that. Every government kind of knows that. The hard part is building the plan, the political support, and the implementation capacity to actually deliver that. So that's the hard work of implementation that we're into now.
Yeah. In terms of policy, we have on the international level, Paris Agreement or other agreements as well, but and then we have to bring it down to the national level and also the state level. This is about a decentralization effort as well. But how do you see the flow, especially from the South global countries?
So I think one of the challenges for climate policy is that everything basically causes climate change or is affected by climate change. So you can't address it in one single ministry sitting in the central government. It has to be something that's mainstreamed across the transportation department and the agricultural department and the forest people and the transportation people, and also not the federal government, the national government, but also regional governments, local communities. It all has to come together. And so one of the big challenges I think we have here is the need to invest in government's capacity to do that. We have a lot of international support that goes for something called capacity building.
Right.
But too much of this money is spent on consultants or PowerPoint presentations. And what governments actually need is someone to work in their office, right? And to actually do the work of putting together projects. Like that's the real slightly boring but important part of what we have to do now.
So political challenges, especially in, I would like to focus about ASEAN because political situation in ASEAN is quite unique in that sense. And then we are still stuck of being, because they wanted to win an election. So it's always about popular decision being made. But how do we strike a balance in philosophical area in terms of win election and also at the same time doing the right things to combat climate change?
Well, I was very happy to see last year the largest country in ASEAN, Indonesia, had elections. Obviously, people paid a lot of attention to this, and the outcome was more continuity than change. But you saw the new government in Indonesia take the decision right after they won the election to announce a very ambitious timeline for phasing out coal power plants in Indonesia, which is a huge source of energy for Indonesia. So I think you can see political incentives flowing in that direction. Now, the Indonesian government has a big challenge now to deliver that plan, but the fact that they announced it shows the political support for that. And why? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people are interested in this. They breathe air that's really harmful for them and their children. And that's a political winner if you frame it in the right way.
And as for Malaysia, for instance, we have a lot of investment in terms of data center, and it requires a lot of energy consumption and water consumption as well. And we keep having this conversation that we should generate it more green and also cleaner energy, but at the same time, Malaysia is still struggling in terms of that. But how do you see that countries with countries who are actually attracting all these data centers should manage and strike a balance in terms of energy generating for data centers?
Well, this is the huge economic opportunity that I think people are really racing for. So every big tech company that wants to do AI is seeking a huge amount of power for it. And they really, really want that power to be stable and reliable and green. And so if you are trying to sell power and sell data centers to Apple or Google or Tencent or any of the big companies that are rushing into this realm, they're looking to pay a price premium for green energy. So countries that have the natural endowments, wind, sun, geothermal, hydro, whatever they are, and can turn them into energy are going to win this economic race. So I think for Malaysia, there's a huge opportunity here. And Malaysia has made great progress recently, for example, by allowing the export of renewable energy to have a big client in Singapore. It's a huge money maker for the government and for the people. So this is, I think, the model to follow. How to do it? There's many things that need to come into place to make kind of clean energy revolution take off. One is making sure it's easy to permit. The right incentives are there, finding space for them. These are all kind of complicated implementation questions, so it's not like a silver bullet you say, here's the switch, now you flip it on. It's more bringing together communities, finding support, having a plan. But I think I'm very optimistic about what Malaysia can achieve in this way, because there's a huge market there, and Malaysia has all the resources it needs to succeed. Yeah,
we have the ASEAN grid in terms of energy transition and also energy generation. But at the same time, we are facing with the world that is changing rapidly in terms of political and also other stuff as well. When we have Trump in the US who believes that we should use more fossil fuel, right? But how do we strike a balance? How do we do this without interference of the superpower that be in terms of the understanding of how do we combat climate change?
So I think most countries are looking at what's going on in the United States, which is my own country where I come from, and thinking, this isn't a really good way to run a country where you switch every few years from one policy to another. And I think you have to look more deeply at what the economic transformation is doing. So under the first Trump administration, renewable energy in the United States increased hugely. It went up a huge amount. So did oil and gas. But oil and gas also increased during the Biden administration, right? Because the United States is having a very successful fracking-led oil and gas production expansion. So the United States has its own pathway based on its own resources. But does that actually affect what Malaysia should do? I don't think so, because I think Malaysia has a very clear interest in driving to the head of this transition because you have so many resources, renewable resources, because you have this huge economic opportunity to become a manufacturer of these sort of new technologies and to have a really valuable role in the value chain. And if you look at that, why would you give that up?
I spoke to Prof. Yunus in World Economic Forum. They talk about a lot of things about ASEAN, especially to have a different standard in terms of developing ASEAN, and also the objectives that we want to achieve. And that includes the energy transition as well. But how do you see that we should have, especially the developing countries in ASEAN, should have different mold in that sense and standard in terms of combating climate change and the way we do business and development? Should we have a different standard in terms of green transition for ASEAN, for developing countries, and advanced countries, especially in the Euro and also the Western countries, understand the needs of doing this?
So I think every country should look very carefully at its own cost-benefit analysis. What do we get from investing more in the green transition? What do we need to make that successful? And I think that's what the new structure of the Paris Agreement allows countries to do. They set their own nationally determined contributions, as they're called. So no one's forcing any country to do something it doesn't want to do. And so I think what is really exciting, though, is how these new economic opportunities that are coming out of the green transition are drawing countries in. Countries have this big ability to transition. They also know that the risks of climate change are extremely severe for a country like Malaysia. This is really an existential question for many communities in the country. And so by having this kind of balance of opportunity and risk, I think most countries are finding their way to faster action. Now, we need to do more. And some of the hardest things are around getting rid of the dirtiest sources of energy like coal, and not creating long-lasting assets that might be risky in the future. So that's, I think, where a political commitment is needed, a long-term vision. But the opportunity is so strong, I can't see any way to move away from it.
You mentioned about the Indonesia of the post-election, especially, and the Prabowo. It's very interesting, but how do you see the political will, especially from the other side of the world, in terms of having the right policies, and at the same time, the public sectors as well, not just greenwashing and doing things just to please the government in terms of having correct policies, but how do actually the right things that have tangible impact?
I think one of the most exciting examples I saw on climate action last year actually came from Pakistan.
Right.
Pakistan has a very underdeveloped energy grid. So people don't have access to power when they need it for lights, for refrigeration, for air conditioning, all the things that people need. Last year, Pakistan imported something like 13 gigawatts of solar panels from China. Not because of any government program, not because of any international agreement, because people really needed a solution for the desperate power lack that they faced. And so this is, to me, a really promising sign, because it shows that we're now at a point where clean energy is just so attractive, it's providing a development solution without any kind of intervention from the government. Now, of course, we got there because of a lot of government policies and support to get to that point. But this is, to my mind, is a crystal clear example of how we can now put aside this old thinking that there's some sort of trade-off between development or economic growth and climate transition. Those are actually now the same thing.
My last question, but how do you see the effort of combating climate change from advanced countries and from developing countries as well? I don't know, 10 years down the road.
I think we are now, for all the reasons I've said, at this kind of energy transition tipping point. But there are two big questions I think we still have to really focus on to get right. One is, how do we actually dial down fossil fuels?
Right.
So we're very good at adding new things. We're adding a lot of new renewable energy, and over time, of course, that will displace demand for fossil fuels. We actually have to speed up the phasing down and ultimately phasing out of coal, of oil, of gas. And that's quite costly, right? We have to think about how the people who depend on those kinds of economic resources get a bright future, how some of the shareholders, which include also our governments sometimes, how they have a transition that makes sense. And so that's a really important piece of it. The other piece I think we're not nearly doing enough on is adapting to the impacts of climate change and making our economies and our societies more resilient. For example, for floods, droughts, heat waves, fires. Look at what's happening in Los Angeles this week, where a rich city is really struggling with a very predictable and predicted impact of climate change. And so we need to do much more on that side as well.
But do you see that the governments around the world understand the planetary health, essentially have more lot of consequence to the poverty, for instance? Do you think that the government understands that?
I think it's easy for governments to see the connections. What's hard is for them to operationalize them because of kind of siloed thinking. So, for example, one of the most biggest costs almost every government faces, especially in aging societies, is the healthcare spending. One of the biggest drivers of healthcare spending is things like chronic diseases like diabetes or cancer, many of which are connected to air pollution, many of which are connected to unsustainable food systems. And so if we had more prevention in our, for example, reducing air pollution or reducing the nasty chemicals we put into food, we actually would save a huge amount of money in the future. And the long-term savings would be net positive on aggregate. But governments aren't always very good at putting together those pieces because you have the health ministry over here, the finance ministry over here, the environment ministry over here. So what you really need is leadership from prime ministers, from presidents, from all politicians who have kind of see these connections to draw that together.
All right. Lastly, the downside risk that you see in terms of combating climate change moving forward that we should look out for.
I think we should be very worried about the political impacts of climate change.
Right.
I think as we see a world that warms more and more, we'll have impacts like the fires in Los Angeles this week and last week, like floods, like heat waves. And in that kind of world, people will have a very natural and understandable need for immediate protection.
Right.
And so they'll be less long-term in their views, they'll be less generous in their thinking about the rest of the world, they'll be very focused on protecting themselves.
Yes.
And so as we have more and more climate change, that's a really dangerous set of political conditions to create, because in a world where everyone's trying to just protect themselves, actually we lose the ability to have more efficient solutions, which are the global long-term prevention that is really at the core of stopping this problem.
All right. Prof, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your insights. That's all for this summer. I hope to see you again.
Thank you for coming.